This is Dr. Jason Hoeksema, and we're going to continue with Chapter 20, Strategies of Life. The rest of this chapter focuses on strategies of organisms for survival and reproduction. And the first point that we need to understand is that for organisms to survive, they have two basic tasks. First of all, they have to obtain and distribute molecules for both energy and for structure. Energy powers all of the chemical reactions that organisms need to grow and reproduce, and organisms also need structure. Their cells are built from certain kinds of molecules, and those are necessary for growth and reproduction as well. So organisms need to obtain and distribute these molecules for energy and structure, and then they need to reproduce. One general point before we get into some specific examples is that for obtaining energy, there are two main strategies that organisms have used. First of all, chemotrophy for obtaining energy means getting energy from chemicals. Chemo refers to chemical, and these organisms consume molecules, usually organic molecules, that contain energy in the chemical bonds between atoms. A second strategy for obtaining energy is to be a phototroph. These organisms get their energy from sunlight. Photo refers to light. Secondly, there are two main strategies for obtaining carbon. You can be an autotroph and obtain your carbon from the air, from carbon dioxide specifically, or you can be a heterotroph and obtain your carbon by consuming, again, organic carbon-containing molecules. If you put the energy strategy together with the carbon strategy, you have a classification for a major strategy of life. And we're going to look at one example here of the fungi. All fungi are chemoheterotrophs. If we just quickly go back, remember, chemo refers to a strategy for obtaining energy, and hetero refers to a strategy for obtaining carbon. So what does this mean? Chemoheterotrophs obtain both their energy and their carbon by consuming organic molecules, which are dead or alive tissues of other organisms. A specific version of this strategy is employed by fungi, and that is absorptive nutrition through hyphae. Fungi have, their bodies are built from long, narrow strings of cells. These are microscopic. They're about less than 10 microns in diameter. A micron is a thousandth of a millimeter, a micrometer. And hyphae are these long strings of cells that are very narrow. They have a high surface area to volume ratio, and this allows fungi to absorb their food from the environment. They put out enzymes into the environment. Those enzymes break down complex molecules into simpler ones, and those simple molecules are then absorbed. This is exactly like what happens in your gut. You exude enzymes into your small intestine, for example. Those enzymes break down your food into smaller molecules, and then you absorb those smaller molecules into your bloodstream. Fungi do the same thing, not into their bloodstream, but into their hyphae, and then they distribute those smaller molecules to provide carbon and energy for powering their metabolism and building their cells. A second key aspect of fungi, key characteristic of fungi, is that they reproduce by spores. Spores are single cells that are released and used to move a fungus from one place to another. So a lot of times that's through the air. Fungi disperse from one place to another through the air. But in a lot of cases, also, in an example I'll discuss later, spores are moved not through the air, not by flying through the air, but by animals, for example. Okay, a closer look at the fungal body. How are fungi built? As I mentioned, they are built by hyphae, which are strings of cells. What is a mass of hyphae called? That is a mycelium, M-Y-C-E-L-I-U-M. That is the body of the fungus. When you put together thousands of hyphae, you get something that is visible and macroscopic, and that is the mycelium. Mycelium can be amorphous, just a mat, a mold, or it can be molded into structures that you might recognize, like a mushroom, for example. Now, why are hyphae particularly suited for the absorptive nutrition of fungi? Think about that for a minute. I mentioned it on the previous slide. Well, it's because hyphae have a high surface area relative to their volume, so they're very effective for absorbing nutrients out of the environment. On the bottom right, that's an image of a mycelium growing on a petri dish. Labeled on there are vegetative and aerial hyphae, but what I want you to get from this is that when you put together thousands of hyphae, you have something that you can see, and that is the body of the fungus. Okay, now a quiz here to see if you remember the numbers that I threw out just a minute ago. How narrow are fungal hyphae? Write down an answer. Okay, the correct answer is number 2, between 1 and 10 microns in diameter. That's very, very small. On the bottom left, you see a neat image that shows the outline of fungal cells that are strung together. Each of those cells is about 1 or 2 microns wide and a little bit longer than that. What you see between cells is cross walls that divide adjacent cells. Some fungi have those and some don't. Now, I have to mention an exception to everything I was just saying about fungal structure. Yeasts are actually not made of long strings of hyphae, but rather yeasts are unicellular fungi. They are made of one cell, unicellular. They act a lot like bacteria because they grow really fast. They're unicellular. They can grow on media rapidly, just like bacteria. But their cells are a little bit larger than bacterial cells and structured very differently in their anatomy. An interesting group of fungi are those that cannot be classified cleanly into the yeast or the mold or mycelial fungal groups. These fungi are called dimorphic fungi. These are usually pathogens that when they are growing like a yeast, it's at 37 degrees Celsius, and that temperature should ring a bell. What do you think of when you think of 37 degrees Celsius? Well, that's equivalent to 98.6 Fahrenheit, which is human body temperature. So these fungi grow like yeasts when they get into your body and they cause disease. Out in the environment, when they're living on chicken dung, for example, they grow like a mold. They grow as a mycelium, but then they make spores that get into the air and you can potentially breathe them in, and then they cause disease. A lot of times these diseases are fairly harmless, but sometimes they do cause nasty symptoms. Now, before we look at some specific fungi and some images of fungal structures that you might recognize, we need to understand the general fungal life cycle. How do fungi reproduce? Well, on the left of this image, you can see a really simple way that fungi reproduce. They have a mycelium that produces hyphae, and those hyphae can produce spores. Those spores are genetically identical to the hyphae producing them, and those spores are not the product of sexual reproduction. They're just simply clones of the hyphae that made them. Those spores can then fly through the air and land in a good environment for the fungus where there's food, and then germinate, and new hyphae can grow from those spores. It's a really simple process. That's called asexual reproduction because sex is not involved. Only one hypha is necessary. Only one type of fungus is necessary for this reproductive strategy. A more complex strategy is sexual reproduction, shown on the right. In this case, you need mycelia or hyphae from 2 different kinds of fungi of the same species but different genetic types. When they encounter each other, they will merge their cells, creating a single cell with multiple nuclei, and then those nuclei will fuse, doubling the number of chromosome copies in the cell. In many cases, this process takes place in a mushroom-like structure. What's shown here is a cup, which is a really typical mushroom for certain kinds of fungi. And what happens in that cup is that after nuclear fusion, you have a diploid nucleus, which has 2 copies of each chromosome. And then we have a cell division process called meiosis, where each copy of each chromosome aligns and exchanges some material and then separates into multiple cells. And what we end up with is multiple nuclei that are, again, only haploid, or they have only 1 copy of each chromosome. But they're genetically diverse because they came from multiple parents, and they are the result of crossing over and independent alignment of the multiple copies of each chromosome. The result of this is spores that are the product of sexual reproduction, and therefore they're not the same as the spores of their parents. They're genetically distinct from each other and from their parents. Okay, here are some images illustrating asexual reproduction in the phylum Ascomycota of the fungi. On the left you can see Penicillium mold, where it's bluish or blue-green. That is where asexual reproduction is happening. And if we zoom in on that blue-green zone, we see these grape-like structures, which are called conidia. These are the asexual spores. So these are reproductive structures that allow the fungus to get from one place to another. They're asexual, so they are just genetic clones of the mycelium that produced them. These structures, on the other hand, are sexual mushrooms of those same types of fungi. When you see one of these, what is happening is sexual reproduction. This is the result of 2 different mating types of fungi coming together, merging, and going through meiosis, which produces genetically diverse sexual spores. On the top left is a cup fungus like we saw on our diagram. On the right is one of the most delicious edible mushrooms in the world, and that's the morel, which is essentially a compound cup. All of these little crevices in the cap of this mushroom are individual cups. On the bottom left, we have an example of what I mentioned before, which is the production of spores that are not dispersed in the air, but rather by animals. What you see on the bottom left there are truffles. Truffles are mushrooms that don't pop up above ground and spit their spores into the air, but rather what they do is they develop in the soil, and they smell delicious to mammals like us, and also squirrels and mice who dig them up and eat them. And they get some nutrition out of that, but they also pass the spores into their waste, which is distributed in the environment, and that's how these spores move from one place to another, is by utilizing a mammal to do it for them. Mushroom gills and their sexual spores are shown on this slide. Some mushrooms have blade-like structures called gills on the base of their cap, on the underside of their cap. These mushrooms produce spores from the edges of these gills. And on the right you can see the spore-producing structures that are found on gills. There's a video linked here that you can watch on your own time from the online posted version of the PowerPoint presentation. You should click on that link and you should see a really neat video showing time-lapse photography of mushroom development. This is a really interesting mushroom. This is probably the most famous mushroom in the world. This is in the genus Amanita. Amanita has a long history of use by humans because it is hallucinogenic, and it can cause humans to have wild dreams and feel feelings of euphoria. It's been used recreationally and also religiously for hundreds or even thousands of years. The people in Siberia, in Northeast Asia, the ancient peoples there, when there was a strong class structure, there were rich people and poor people. The rich people, the lords of the manor, would eat this mushroom recreationally, and the toxins would pass through them and cause these effects. But a little known fact is that the toxins that cause hallucinations in this mushroom are not altered before they pass into the urine, and the poor serfs would collect the urine of the wealthy lords and drink the urine in order to get the hallucinogenic effects. You may be more familiar with the version of this mushroom that's found on the Mario Brothers video games. It was also seen on cave paintings in ancient Italy, suggesting that people in that region were big fans of this mushroom. And these days, it is still used recreationally around the world, although it does have some dangers associated with that. So that is a warning I have to mention. A phenomenon that is often very noticeable regarding mushrooms is that they grow in rings called fairy rings. I want to explain what this is. The question you need to ask yourself is, where is the body of the fungus? Where is the mycelium? And that helps you understand what exactly is a fairy ring. Well, in this case, the mycelium is underground, and it starts in the center and it grows out from there in a circle, eating food along the way, consuming organic matter. When it has grown large enough and consumed enough food, then it reproduces by making mushrooms, and that's why you get mushrooms around the edge of a fairy ring. These are poisonous mushrooms shown here, really common large white mushrooms that are poisonous that grow commonly around the University of Mississippi, so watch out for those. Okay, now I mentioned that all fungi are chemoheterotrophs, but there are in fact three distinct ways that fungi obtain organic molecules for energy and carbon. First of all, most fungi are decomposers or saprobes. This means that they send out enzymes to break down complex molecules in dead organic matter, specifically dead. A second way for fungi, however, to get energy and carbon is to be a pathogen. And quite a few fungi are pathogens, and this means attacking living organisms, causing disease. A third strategy is to be a mutualist, and this means entering into a partnership of sorts with either plants or algae. Now, why plants or algae? Plants or algae are photosynthetic, and they have potentially lots of sugars at their disposal to trade with these fungi to provide the food for these fungi. What do the fungi get in return? We'll talk about that in a minute. What do the plants or algae get in return? We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so most fungi are decomposers. You can see this strategy here. What is that amorphous structure under the moss there that you see in this photo? Well, that's a dead log in the woods, and mushrooms are coming out of it. But what you want to think about is, well, where is the fungus? Well, yes, you can see the mushrooms, but remember, the mushrooms are reproductive structures. Those are sexual structures, but most of the body of the fungus is actually in the substrate. It's in the log, eating that log and feeding those mushrooms. Mushrooms are like fruit on a tree. If you pick them, the tree is still there. In this case, the fungal mycelium is still there. Many fungi are pathogens. Here are a couple of examples of plant pathogenic fungi. There's a rust fungus on the left eating that plant, and on the right is an ergot fungus eating wheat seeds. Here is another link to a video that I highly recommend about cordyceps fungi, which are fascinating pathogens that attack insects. And you need to watch that video on your own time by clicking on the link on the PowerPoint presentation that I've uploaded separately. Now, the third strategy that I mentioned is to be a mutualist. Lichens are one such mutualist between fungi and algae. Now, what benefits do each partner receive? I mentioned that fungi receive, in these partnerships, they receive sugars. Algae are photosynthetic. In this case, it's single-celled algae that live inside the fungi. They absorb energy and carbon dioxide from sunlight, energy from sunlight and carbon dioxide from the air, and they make sugars, and they give some of that to the fungus. In return, the fungus is providing the algae with a competition-free space to live, and also providing some nutrients that they absorb from rock and bark. If you look out on our campus, you will find these lichens, these crusty gray and bluish lichens growing all over the place, especially on the bark of trees, but also on rocks and building walls. Here's a photo on the left of lichens growing on a tree, and on the right you can see a section cartoon drawing of where the algae live inside the fungi. Lichens can grow in very harsh habitats, tree bark and rocks. This is a photo from a remote volcanic island off the coast of Mexico showing diverse and beautiful lichens living on the rocks there. A second way that fungi can be mutualists is to partner not with algae but with plants. But the relationship is the same. Plants provide carbon in the form of sugars to the fungus, and in return the fungus provides soil nutrients back to the plant. This is just like the lichen, except that in this case the photosynthetic partner is a plant rather than an algae. In this case, the fungi live on the roots of the plant and extend out into the soil and act like an extended root system for the plant, absorbing nutrients from the soil and giving some of them to the plant. There's a close-up of what these structures look like. This partnership is called mycorrhizae. Myco for fungus and rhizo or rhizae for roots. R-H-I-Z refers to plant roots. Mycorrhizae. Many of these fungi make mushrooms that are very common in the woods. And if you go out into the woods around here, you will see lots of mushrooms at certain times of the year, and a lot of those are the products of mycorrhizal fungi on the roots of the oak trees and hickory trees and other common tree species around here. Most plants are mycorrhizal and have these fungi on their roots, and they're really essential for the survival and growth of plants. And vice versa, these trees and other plants are really essential for the fungus. So this is a partnership that benefits both species, and therefore we call it a mutualism. Okay, now a few minutes on strategies of animals and how they differ from the strategies of fungi and how they're similar. So, similar to fungi, all animals are chemoheterotrophs. In other words, in order to get energy and carbon, they need to consume organic molecules. Organic molecules being molecules that contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. However, animals need to engulf their food before absorbing it. They can't absorb it through their skin like fungi absorb food through their cell walls. Animals need to put it inside their gut first before absorbing the food. Most animals have highly differentiated tissues and organ systems. That's a little bit different than fungi. Fungi have different tissues and systems, but not nearly as distinctive and complex as with animals. And animals are very diverse and have lots of different types, so it's difficult to generalize about them in some ways. These are the major groups of animals that you might recognize, all the way from worms to insects, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Fungi are pretty close relatives of the animals, and if we had a bigger tree of life here, you would find the fungi grouping quite close to the animals. We're going to spend a few minutes here talking about one of the most important groups of animals, and those are the invertebrate animals. Invertebrate animals have no backbone. That is why they're named invertebrates. They don't have vertebrae. These are the most diverse animals on Earth, and that's why we're going to spend a couple of minutes talking about them. For example, there's a subgroup of invertebrates called the arthropods that make up about 70% of known animal species. This includes the insects, but also others. Arthropods have a distinctive structure, which is to have an exoskeleton. They don't have bones, but rather an exterior structure that provides rigidity. And arthropods have this, and other invertebrate animals often do as well. Arthropods are species that you probably recognize. In the middle is a beetle, on the left is a spider, on the right is a crab. All of these are different kinds of arthropods, and all of them have exoskeletons to provide rigidity. Plants have a pretty different strategy than animals. Plants are mostly photoautotrophs. Rather than being chemoheterotrophs, they're photoautotrophs. They get both their carbon and their energy from the air and from sunlight, from photosynthesis. So they obtain their energy from sunlight. That is the photo part of that strategy name. And they get their carbon molecules from inorganic carbon sources, especially carbon dioxide. Plants can reproduce sexually or asexually, just like fungi. And I'm going to show you some examples of reproductive structures of plants. Bryophytes are a particular kind of plant that include mosses. They don't have roots. They have very primitive root-like structures. Because they don't have true roots that can go deep into the soil, they're very dependent on water for their survival, so you tend to only find them in very moist places. Vascular plants, on the other hand, have more elaborate structures for moving water around their bodies, including roots that go down into the soil and absorb water. And then they have vascular structures, specific cells that are designed to transport water from one place to another in their bodies. They're efficient at transporting and controlling water movement throughout their bodies. Reproduction in vascular plants can be seedless. You can have reproduction, for example, by just cloning. Some plants grow by cloning themselves, making just little copies that drop off and start growing. On the other hand, most plants have seeds and are either gymnosperms or angiosperms. Gymnosperms are seed plants that do not make flowers and fruits. They make seeds in a cone, but they do not make flowers and fruits. Angiosperms are flowering plants, and they're defined by their flower. They have a flower which needs to be typically needs to be pollinated for seeds to be produced, and then that flower develops into some kind of a fruit. And just a little bit of anatomy of angiosperms, the flowering plants. On the right, you see a typical flower, which has petals, and then it has male and female reproductive parts. The ovary is the female part where the eggs are contained. The male parts are the pollen, which contains sperm. And for angiosperms to reproduce, typically pollen needs to get to the ovary to fertilize the eggs. In a lot of flowering plants, this pollination happens by insects and other arthropods, and also vertebrate animals moving pollen from the stamen of a flower to the ovary of a plant. A little bit on the design of vascular plants. On this diagram here, you can see some of the important structures of plants. You can see roots growing into the soil, which roots will include root hairs, which are fine structures that allow plants to absorb water and nutrients out of the soil. But remember, a lot of these plants will have mycorrhizal fungi extending from their roots into the soil and helping them absorb nutrients out of the soil more efficiently. Above ground, typical plants have stems and leaves, and then flower buds. And this is our last slide for this chapter. And this shows just an illustration of some of the typical structures of flowering plants. And this is a neat picture because it shows a developmental series. What is the youngest part of this plant that we see here? Well, it's this flower, this immature flower that's right in the center here, this pinkish flower. After that flower is pollinated, pollen reaches the ovary, the eggs will start to mature, and this flower will start to turn into a fruit. If you move to the right, you can see a small young fruit. That's essentially a baby lime that is developing. You can still see remnants of the flower, but it's a small fruit that's starting to develop. And then at the end of the branch, over further to the left here, you see a mature fruit. So picture the development from a flower to a young fruit to a mature fruit. And this is what happens in some version or another in all flowering plants. Okay, that's it for chapter 20, and we will see you soon.